Will democracy die in 2024? You might think it's a hyperbolic question, but there are some worrying signs on the horizon as the world, yes, the world, goes into elections that may very well determine the future of democracy. We want you to join us in an effort to get that decision to be for democracy and for humanity. I'm Spartacus Olsson, and this is a TimeGhost public service announcement. Some of you may know me from the War Against Humanity series in our World War II in real-time format, but today I'm here to talk about the war for humanity. I'm reaching out to you about a new TimeGhost format for 2024 about how democracy came to succeed and fail in the past. I'm going to tell you how you can be part of this timely project and how your participation will make sure that it is realized. But before I get to that, some background. I grew up during the Cold War. The first 21 years of my life were lived under the fear of the atomic apocalypse, and as a Westerner, the fear of resurgence of the totalitarianism that led to World War II. I began studying the horrors of that war and how the world could have descended into that tyranny already as a young child. Yes, I was an odd kid. Then came November 9th, 1989, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. I and everyone I know, significantly my TimeGhost co-founders Astrid and Indy, know where we were at that moment and what we did. We celebrated and we rejoiced because what we believed in our heart of hearts was that freedom, democracy, and decency had won. We celebrated that victory for a decade as liberty, democracy, and international respect and cooperation took hold of more and more of the world. The idea that this was the end of history was in the air. As a lover of historiography, I had my doubts about that, and I found kindred spirits in Indy and Astrid. Already back then, we felt that for the recent advancements to become stable, the world needed to know history from all of humanity's perspective to understand our common past and grow together, not see history from a distorted, subjective view to grow further apart. Years later, that became the founding principle of what we do here at TimeGhost. In the meantime, though, the celebrations went on, and 23 years ago, at the Millennium Shift, for the first time in human history, 54% of all people, a majority of humanity, lived in free, open democracies, formerly called electoral and liberal democracies. But then, the fragile foundation we had built in the decade after the Cold War took repeated hits, and the forces of autocracy, intolerance, and conflict came back in force. For 2 decades, while continuing to research the reasons why and how we have failed in the noble strife towards liberty and humanity in the past, I have watched how the world once again spirals towards darkness. Right now, as the first quarter of the 21st century approaches, the percentage of people living in proper democracies has dropped to 29%. And it's not a stretch to say that for many of us who still do live in a democracy, the threats to our freedom, our need for accountable government, politically independent courts, and free and fair elections are under threat. Anti-democratic sentiments are on the rise both on the left and the right side of the spectrum. Populism and gaslighting has become acceptable discourse. Debates are increasingly impossible in a culture of political hyperbole with a disdainful disregard for verifiable facts. Why would democracy end specifically in 2024? Well, it's a global election year. Not just an election in the US, but in over 40 countries and legislative bodies, there will be some form of national election, which by some estimates will immediately impact the lives of a quarter of the world's population. These include 3 legislations where the majority of those of you watching are based: the US, EU, and probably the UK. But beyond these, there are also elections in places with massive economies and populations, such as in Korea, Taiwan, and Indonesia, and elections in a number of countries with either fledgling, challenged, or already failed democracies, such as India, Venezuela, Iran, Mexico, and Russia. In fact, by our estimates, quite literally, over 90% of our audience will in one way or another go to the polls in the next year. Nearly every nation voting has seen an extreme shift in their domestic and international political landscape since their last election. And if we do not remember the moments in history when we collectively failed ourselves, then the world risks being swept by a tidal wave of hate, tyranny, and international rivalry, a wave that has already hit too many coastlines of humanity. And that's why I'm talking about this on a history channel on YouTube. As I indicated earlier, our mission here at TimeGhost is knowledge, education, and to present a historiography not based on special interests, not serving a specific ideology or the national interests of one nation above the other, not for a subset of humanity, but for all of humanity and for the sake of humanity itself. We are dedicated to the facts as best we know them, because if we know our past, we can forge a future based on humanity's best experience without repeating the mistakes of our ancestors. The demagogues of the world also know this, and consequently we are experiencing an extreme weaponization of history to serve the interests of war, political extremism, and totalitarian control. Therefore, I am speaking to you today to ask you to join us in our effort to fight against that trend, to join our effort to present to the world the naked facts free of distortion and manipulation, because that is what we do and what our community enables us to do. It began a decade ago when my best friend, Indy Neidell, my wife, Astrid, Deinhard, and I started the Great War Channel. That began as a dedication to our belief in telling history from a global, non-partisan perspective. And in the 10 years since, the reasons we have devoted our lives to public history have only grown. Through the years covering history chronologically, we have come to respect the power that public interactive historiography, freely accessible to people the world over, has to positively impact the contemporary world that we live in. We have learned that through the chronological coverage of the interwar period, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Second World War, and more. We believe that each of our series contain innate lessons which do not need to be spelled out or preached, because through an objective, non-partisan presentation as events unfolded, the real-time descent into horror can be relived and understood firsthand. On that journey, we have found a vast community that shares these passions and convictions. And that community, the TimeGhost Army, has empowered us to reach several million people with a little bit of knowledge that might enable them to do their part to keep us all inside the guardrails of decency, international order based on cooperation, and societies based on the universal and inalienable human rights agreed upon after the tragic calamity of World War II. Since TimeGhost was founded, that has always been our mission, not to make money or to become famous, but to promote a better understanding of our present times and possible futures by spreading a better understanding of our past. And many of you see that as when you have written to us asking we cover the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza, the internal polarization of democratic societies, and the sharp rise in anti-democratic ideas. That is why we will be doubling down in our efforts with a brand new TimeGhost series on the history of democracy and revolutions to begin this coming spring. This series will be demanding. We find it fitting that in the year of elections, we launched the first season of the series, 36 episodes covering the collapse of the German Weimar Republic and the rise of Adolf Hitler. A story which follows one of the world's most advanced liberal democracies of the time descending into a horrific expression of tyranny. It will be released on a weekly basis following the events month by month as Hitler spearheads Germany's descent into the abyss as he goes from an unpopular populist candidate for president of Germany to chancellor and soon to become Führer and supreme ruler over the Nazi Reich. Like with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we will present this based first and foremost on primary sources, showing how the partisan media outlets, being either fascist or communist, socialist or liberal, progressive or conservative, covered the exact same events. A story that serves as an important reminder about the fragility of democracy as almost all of us head to the polls in elections that may very well decide the very existence of our electoral and liberal democracies. And to be perfectly clear, we're not doing this for one political side or the other, but in support of all candidates, all parties, both left and right, that stand for the principles of democracy. We want every one of you to join us in making this possible. To increase our production output will require bringing on new researchers, another writer, a second studio, and fully dedicated video editors just for the new project. Not to mention the cost of source materials and archival videos. Measured in money, we're speaking of around $17,500 per month, or 1,167 members of the TimeGhost Army pledging $15 a month. We know that behind every screen of the hundreds of thousands watching our videos each week, there is a person who takes what they learn to heart. A person who will have discussions with their friends, family, co-workers, who will vote in an election, who will recognize something on a paper or in a speech that they know has not worked well in the past. And it might just be enough to tip the balance between creating a moment in history to be mourned to a moment in history to be celebrated. That is where your pledge is going. So, be one of the 1,167 people who are part of reaching hundreds of thousands of people with this important message at this crucial moment in history by signing up or increasing your pledge by $15 at patreon.com or timeghost.tv so that we can reach our $17,500 goal. Links in the description. Join us in the war for humanity. Never forget.